So we don't have a table yet. Eventually we will.
Yeah.
I'm Sabrina Vourvoulias. I'm a Latina journalist, newspaper editor, and speculative fiction writer. And I proposed this panel because I'm really, really invested in seeing as many Latino speculative fiction writers get a chance to talk about how we fit into this genre, what our particular challenges are. I'm going to quickly introduce everybody else who's on the panel with me and let them really tell you about themselves. But one of the things I want to say is Daniel José Older, who's on the end, maybe, what, was it today or yesterday, tweeted about a Wikipedia entry about speculative fiction writers of color with different little categories, and the Latinos are all Latin Americans. There isn't a single U.S.-born Latino listed in there.
It didn't really have anyone listed. It just had one heading that said "See Magical Realism."
See Magical Realism.
Honestly, I wouldn't mind it if they had some Latin American actual people there.
And then when you go to the Magical Realism,
it kind of broke my heart.
It's all Latin Americans.
It's only left for prayer in this world. You gotta laugh.
So we're going to be completely informal.
Yes.
And I'll let everybody introduce themselves.
Start with me?
Well, I already pointed you out, so why not?
That's fucked up.
And we all agreed we're going to swear a lot in both
Yeah,
languages.
two languages.
Sorry. Exactly, informal. So my name is Daniel José Older. I'm a writer, an essayist, and I used to be a paramedic for 10 years. Not anymore. Now I'm just a writer. My book, Salsa Nocturna, came out in 2012. It's a collection of short stories about ghosts in New York. I edited Long Hidden, which came out in May, which is an anthology of speculative fiction from marginalized histories. Both of them are available at the Cross Genres table. And in January, my first novel comes out, Half Resurrection Blues. Yes. from Rock. Thank you. I'm really excited. It's about a half-dead guy. That's it. It's just about a half-dead guy. And I write a lot about representation and race and publishing. And one thing I wanted to throw out there just in the introduction section, I think we always need to be conscious of anti-blackness and race when we have conversations within the Latino community, because I think that gets lost a lot. So I put that in my introduction because the rooms often look like this, the panels often look like this. And when we look at magazines that are Latino magazines, they often look like this too. And I think that always has to be at the forefront of our consciousness when we're speaking and when we're clear, so that this panel doesn't look like this in the next time and the next time and the next time. And I think we just always need to have the conversation. Beyond that, we always need to have the conversation about why things are the way they are and how do we get them to somewhere better and the next place and all these things. But anyway, I'm really honored to be here. Always a pleasure to be at Readercon and with all these amazing people. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Carlos Fernandez. I don't even want to introduce myself. I just want to start talking about your ideas. Because it's really, really important. Because Sabrina very kind of put in a lot of work to create an iBook with that it contains our bios and introductions and even some thoughts, some musings that several of us offer. And one of the things that I offer that I think relates to your point is that really my color depends on who's looking at me and what they remember about my name. And so I remember being in Florida with some good friends. I would go to their house, and I remember an uncle of a very good friend of mine, just came up to me, and I told him my name, Carlos, pretty clearly. But within 3 minutes, I guess, because I had a pretty good vocabulary and could talk like this and whatever, he started telling me like wetback and spit jokes, like one after another, and just kept going because, I could just be white. Then, it kind of depends on, and then something that I wrote there is that in another time, in my neighborhood, neighborhood kids came and with shaving cream wrote "Spicks Go Home" on our driveway. And the insidious genius of doing that is that the shaving cream eats through the top layer of the grime on the driveway, and so it remains for months.
Wow.
You can't wash it away. You can't get rid of it. And so you just, every morning walking to school, I'd walk over "Spicks Go Home,"
Wow.
and then I'd come in, and but it was funny too. Like we made a joke out of it, like we'd see that the "Spicks Go Home," I'd be like, "Okay, I'm home," And so,
True.
I think one of the things that we have to think about, we have to think about blacklist a lot, but we also have to think about construction and the way that identity is construction, and think very carefully about the ideas that we form and how we can enrich them. I think the problem comes down to the fact that we form ideas too quickly and we act too peremptorily when it comes to decisions about people.
Yeah.
And basically we can be more complicated when we approach people and have different ways of just talking about this. Now we have a table. Okay. So now I'll introduce myself properly. My name is Carlos Hernández. I'm a writer and an academic. I am a professor at the City University of New York. I teach English and creative writing and literature. My home campus is right behind the World Trade Center, a couple blocks away. I've been writing short stories for a long time. I published since 2006. I've been publishing a lot of short stories, mostly in speculative genres. But I have to say that I kind of fell ass backwards into science fiction and fantasy writing because that was the community that was accepting my work. That is, it was the place. And I don't mean in terms of like journals and things like that. It's more like it was the place where I felt in home with the sort of flexibility of thinking and the ability to think about things in complicated categories. One of my big critiques about literary fiction is that it doesn't recognize itself as a genre, and therefore it doesn't see itself as having all the foibles of genre. And so when things become stereotyped in literary fiction, it's much harder to dig that out. And I think that there is in literary fiction a genre of the Latino Bildungsroman that's very, very hard to break out of. So if you're a Latino writer, you're expected always to talk about a very small period of your life, usually between like 12 and let's say 20 or so, and that's the time because that's your coming of age in America, and all those stories that are really important, but have been told many times now. And so I think Latino writers of my generation are going to be looking for ways to think past the Bildungsroman and the constructions of literary history as they exist now. All right, blah, blah, blah.
I'm also going to just say a few more words because I realized I forgot to tell you. I have a novel as well called Ink.
It's really good.
And it actually is going to illustrate a point that I have. I think I'm probably the only Latina at this table who is not born in the United States and who wasn't raised in the United States. And so some of the issues that are issues for Latinos in the United States feel very foreign to me. There is an aspect I also would like to speak about how we as Americans, because I've been a citizen since birth, even though I didn't move here until I was 15, how we Americans project ourselves onto the rest of the world and our understanding of things as much, things that dovetail with both what Daniel is talking about and Carlos, our perceptions of ourselves, our identity, race, class, all of that. We often project our understandings of them onto the rest of the world. And for the immigrant writer, it's especially important to understand that those are things that we explore very heavily. And now, Julia.
Hi, I'm a writer and an editor. I edit short fiction for Strange Horizons, which is an online magazine of science fiction and fantasy. Sabrina has been published in Strange Horizons, and Daniel has been published in Strange Horizons as well. I also have edited other things, including, and I'm going to show this because I just got the copies in the mail today. Ooh. This is a YA. Diverse YA science fiction and fantasy stories. There's actually only one story with a Latino character who is written by a Latino. The rest of them, there are a couple of other Latino characters, but the people who write them weren't Latinos themselves. But I also edited another thing that Sabrina's in called In Other Words with Saira Ali, and I think she's going to have some examples of that here at the con. And tomorrow, when we do the reading, we're going to, Tom Green, who wrote one of the pieces, and he's also a Latino, is going to read one of the pieces at the Latino reading. So
Yes, all of you should go at 1 o'clock. Should come to hear us read.
So yes, basically I'm all about diversity. I also host the Outer Alliance podcast, which is about quilt bag speculative fiction, so that's gay and lesbian and bisexual and trans and intersex. And I am a bi woman. My father was from Mexico, so I'm half Mexican, and he also didn't come here when until he was 15. And he, for his entire life, had an accent, and it was very important to him that we assimilate as much as possible, so he didn't teach me Spanish. And then when I was 12, he expected that I should understand how to speak it perfectly and would yell at me if I made mistakes, so I don't speak Spanish. But I understand a lot of it, and I'm actually going to tell a really funny story because you mentioned swearing. So one of the things that my father did, he was always very playful with things, and he had a cat, it was a Siamese cat, it was kind of a jerk really, and he named the cat CG. And if anybody asked what the cat's initials stood for in English, he would say, oh, center of gravity. But actually, it was chingado gato.
We had a dog named Tita.
I'm Matthew Goodwin, and I just finished my doctorate at UMass in comparative literature, and I lectured there for a while, and just moved to Philadelphia a couple of weeks ago. I worked for about 10 years in nonprofit groups doing legal aid for Latino immigrants. And so when I went into academics to get my doctorate, I was trying to figure out a way to kind of unite like my work in the community and the theoretical work, and it's not easy. It's a tension. And I actually found the same kind of problem that you found, that really a lot of writing centered on children, which is great. Again, yeah, I mean, it's a great thing, but so I started looking outside of that for something to express what I was seeing in the community, and I found science fiction actually was a very interesting way to express the complexity of race and migration, and in a way that just, it doesn't happen in fiction. So my dissertation was on migration in science fiction in Mexico and Puerto Rico and in the US. Like everyone said, the Wikipedia entry has been empty actually for a couple of years. But you know, it's not empty in reality. There are a lot of people writing, so that's kind of cool. So the future is really bright for this particular topic, I feel.
So as I said, there's an iBook, and there are lists, a very incomplete list, but a really, you know, much bigger than the Wikipedia listing of Latino writers. You know, so let's just launch into some of the challenges. I mean, why is it that we're so invisible? What will it take? First of all, how many of you are Latinos in the audience? Okay. How many of you are writers? How many of you are readers? One of the pervasive myths is that Latinos don't write because Latinos don't read. Right. Is that, you've heard that, haven't you? Is that why we're, you know, is that one of the contributors to the Wikipedia issue, the invisibility, the erasure?
I mean, it's a tough question. I think part of it may have to do with assimilation, for instance. You know, my brother for a long time tried to get me to go by Carl, you know, because he thought it was less embarrassing than Carlos. And I think there's a lot of that happening. And so, you know, Martin Sheen isn't Martin Sheen. Martin Sheen's last name is Estevez. You know, and there's a lot of that kind of cover-up that goes on. So I think part of it is the idea that, at least for some immigrants, blending in is actually a virtue. What you want to do is cover yourself. And so I think it's camouflage in a way. You're trying to get by. And I think that might be part of it.
I think we always have to keep in mind the industry and what it looks like and why and what we're up against when we're talking about getting through gatekeepers, which includes agents, editors, the people that buy the books for bookstores, because that's one of the gatekeepers that we don't often talk about. They're sort of unseen, but that's a huge controlling factor in what books get sold and what don't. But basically what it means is that along our path, as writers, we're always going to be coming to these bottlenecked moments where we have to get through somebody, and probably 90-something% of those people are Anglo white people. That matters, because when we're trying to tell our stories and trying to tell them in our true voices and trying to express things sometimes that are inherently anti-racist, anti-white supremacist, just because that's our story, it can be threatening to people. Or just sometimes not even that, just speaking in your true voice can be threatening. Language can be threatening, as we saw with Long Hidden, as we saw with reactions and backlashes that we see, in SIFWA throughout the science fiction history. We see that happen. So,
could you just say a little bit about that? What kind of reactions did people have? What was the backlash against Long
I
Hidden?
can speak a
Yeah,
little
'cause I
bit
didn't
about
know
that.
that.
Go ahead.
As I mentioned, I'm a fiction editor for Strange Horizons, and Strange Horizons was one of the venues that reviewed Long Hidden. I'm not actually anything to do with the reviews department, but the way I understand how the reviews department works is that they have a bunch of reviewers and they assign reviews out. The person who reviewed Long Hidden wrote a review that was then really talked about a lot because she complained about someone using too much dialect.
Yes.
You don't mean
I tell you.
That's one of those things that when you're talking about using language, that can be very threatening to people who are expecting something that's very much what they consider standard American English. And I'm kind of going to wonder what is standard American English, because we have so many regions and people talk differently everywhere. But if you write with dialect, that's one of the things that can really flag it, and people can be like, oh no, I don't want to take a chance on this because it's got...
and what was interesting was that she characterized it as a literary trick.
Yeah.
Which was such a fascinating turn of phrase, and I think that is what happens, that a lot of people in the industry, a lot of white people see us talking the way we talk. In that case, it was Southern Black dialect.
Yeah.
But I think it happens across the board with languages of color, with ways of speaking of color, and with the vernacular. Mind you, James Joyce, spoke in the vernacular as a classic, Shakespeare, of course. But when we're talking about communities of color speaking the way we speak, it becomes another issue because of inherent racism, because of institutional racism, and because of discomfort with the idea of people being proud of who they are. So when I read, for instance, Nalo Hopkinson, who writes in vernacular as the narrator, not in a character voice necessarily, but the narrator speaks in vernacular. It was a revelation to me to read that, it's not my vernacular, but to read it and see that you could do that in a Caribbean voice and speak honestly as the narrator, it blew my mind. Now that's unfortunately the exception, because she's one of the ones that got through. But that's what we're always looking at, is like who has made it through. And then it becomes a question of who has translated, how have we translated ourselves even subconsciously, because we don't think that we'll get through. And sometimes we will, but because we know the history is that we haven't, we have to assume that we have to make our water down our voice to get there, water down our narratives, all these different things.
I think it's even more complex for Latinos, because if you write in Spanish, there's a long sort of commodification, if you want to call it that, of Spanish, of bad Spanish. It's what I call the skippy Johning of the world, because I don't know if you've seen that series of children's books where Skippy John dresses up like a chihuahua and
No.
essentially adds O's and A's on the end of every word to emulate Spanish.
Right.
And that has a lot more readership than anybody who writes bilingually in children's books. So on the Spanish level, we throw Spanish in there and it's a stopper, but an Anglo will write something that is not Spanish, not the way even Spanglish, which has its own politics,
Right.
is written, and that is what will ring true,
Yeah.
because it's what's been seen, right? It's what's been heard.
Yeah.
It's what seems genuine.
Mhm.
Do you all see the, it was on the interwebs maybe like a couple months ago circulating where it was a quote by Hernández, and I'm going to just slaughter it here, but he says something like, motherfuckers will read 100 pages in Elfish, but if you throw in a couple words in Spanish, they get, they lose their shit, or something like that.
Right.
Could be Klingon, too.
Right. But
I mean,
I thought a lot about that though, because I really wanted to think about, well, why will we read fucking songs in Elvish, of an invented language that nobody knows? And I think part of it may have to do with the fact that it's completely depoliticized for us when we approach it. That is, there's no baggage that comes with this thing. Everybody starts out reading Elvish not knowing shit about Elvish, right? You see this word, it doesn't exist for anybody. And so there's kind of a community of construction that needs to form in order to create the meaning of that, or Klingon, or whatever is going to happen. Whereas you are placed in a very different position in relationship to a language that does exist, like Spanish. And therefore, I think what happens is people don't want to deal with it. It's like, oh, that's icky. That's like real worldy. It doesn't let me, just be fanciful about this. And so I think that is part of the problem, that what we're trying to do with representing our culture is to introduce it into the fanciful, and I think that's what the objection is. The objection is that Spanish, because it isn't English, it can't be a neutral language in that same kind of way that English can be, or that a completely invented language could be.
It's also interesting, I think, because there's so many regional variants of Spanish.
Oh, yeah.
That Daniel's Spanish is a really different Spanish than the Spanish I put into my novels, and so.
Let me ask you.
Uh-huh.
When you say ahorita, do you mean now or do
Right
you?
this second.
No, that's wrong. That means in a little while.
I know. A Cuban just came up with. I work in a bilingual majority Latino newsroom, and actually I swear to you that only last week the Cuban salesman came up to me and he said, you and those Mexicans, you're always saying ahorita, and you're always saying it to mean right this second, instead of what it should be, which is in a little while.
Right.
In a little while. But that's all over the place,
Sure.
and all of us have that. And that also plays into how genuine Spanish is depicted, and sometimes my irritation with the depiction of accent. Honestly, sometimes, obviously not so much when it's somebody like you writing it, but I think it's like a cheap, I find that it's often a cheap way. It's a cheap signifier for Latino, right? Now, I moved here when I was 15, and people, damn it, don't tell me I have an accent until they find out I'm Latina. And then it's like, damn, you do have an accent, Oh yeah, I hear your accent, and I think that's, accent becomes the signifier, the one thing you can key in and say, okay, this is a Latino character because I'm rendering accent. So, what about,
Well, I wanted to say one thing about the absence part. One of the things is that when we start thinking about just a category, like Latino science fiction or Latino speculative fiction, it kind of makes us think about the past as well, like past works. For example, Blade Runner. Some people think this is the greatest science fiction film, which, it's a great film. It's also a work of Latino science fiction. The screenplay was written by a Mexican American.
Did not know that.
And that's why you have
Jesus Trevino's?
no, Hampton Fancher.
What?
And
David Peoples was co-written.
Yeah, it's a complicated story, but
Yeah.
and the addition of the Chicano character came from him, and that's you know, that's a really important part of that film. In some ways, he's kind of the most human in that, and it's definitely not a dystopia for him, for Gaff, that Chicano character. So just having the category, in some ways, you know, we limit things by making a category like that. On the other hand, we can see in different directions, and there's a whole history, I think, that I'm interested, you guys are interested, people are becoming interested in that history and uncovering it because it's there.
Right.
I'm always struck by when we think about urban fantasy, and if you take out the fantasy and you think about urban, that's the publisher's code word for black. If you go to the urban section of the bookstore, that's a very specific group of books, often books that shouldn't probably be there, but get thrown in there because they have black people on the covers. So there's this whole politics around that. But then when you put the fantasy in, it becomes totally gentrified. It's a very white, urban fantasy is an almost entirely white category of writers. Which is kind of fucked up, because who's writing about the city? Is it people that live in the city? Is it people that live in which sections of the city? There's all these politics to that too. And I always also think then about who originally was telling the urban fantasy story. So yes, because of what we just spoke about with whiteness and power and race, the way it works in publishing, that's what we see when we think about urban fantasy. We think about, X is killing off all the Y, so someone has to stop it by mixing with a were turkey or whatever. This very specific formulaic urban fantasy that involves one white person usually having sex with a Native American werewolf. And lots of these over and over and over, with very problematic representations of people of color. Cartoons or evil, basically, needed to be saved or killed off. What about the stories that we have always told as dwellers of the city and as people of color that are speculative? What about the ghost stories, the urban fantasy ghost stories, the zombies, the orishas that we have and the spirits that we have always worked with that aren't, New York Times bestsellers and aren't even in print necessarily. But I always think it's important to take the history of literature back to the spoken word, because that's always where it began. Even though we're not always comfortable with that, and a lot of writers aren't happy reading out loud, it's still the root of what we do. Storytelling is still the root of what we do. And that, inherently is something that our people have always done. But now we've become detached from that because of these very crude mechanisms of power, of publishing, and of money, and of race. So to me, it's always important to take it back there, and then from that root, then how do we move forward from there?
But one of the things that I originally called this East, West, and everything between, because my idea was that we'd have Latinos from the West Coast, from the Midwest, from different areas contributing via Google Hangout. The hotel can't do it, but never mind. But there are very big differences regionally. And urbanism is one of them. Does every Latino story have to be urban when California has a long tradition of agrarian Latinos? Pennsylvania is full of agrarian Latinos. The urban story, and you never see stories in the mainstream that are set in small towns or in rural settings that have the occasional Latino character. We are the story that has become a trope, really, is the urban Latino. And that's only one expression of Latinidad across the United States. When I put together this list of writers, I was like stunned. Okay, there's a Latino spec fic writer in Washington State. There's, I knew Midwestern, I knew all over, but we don't think in those terms. We don't think, if we're writing about, some rural enclave, that there would be a big community of Latinos. And I think that's part of our sort of like, our inability to see past what is already a trope. What already we see, even if it's not Latinos writing it. I have to laugh because one of I just recently sold 2 stories to Tor.com, and I'm thrilled about it. But I'm convinced that the reason one of them sold is because it's an urban setting, which is very unusual for me. And so it's, you know, I really feel like that's another one of those handles that.
The piece I'm going to read tomorrow is a Suburban Fantasy. I just want you to know that.
You know what's really funny? I'm going to read the urban one.
Oh, see,
So
we're crossed. But I dedicated to you.
Mine's a Latino fantasy in outer space. So urban, suburban, it's extraterrestrial.
I support that. I support that. That's good. All right.
So, you know, I had always envisioned this as a conversation. So as we're having the conversation up here, I want you to feel free to jump in and ask her, okay,
Okay, I had a thought which I don't know is true, and I'd like to put to you, and then another thought as to a cure, as it were. But one thought why perhaps people have bigger problems grasping the Latino thing is because you have a diaspora. So many of you are from so many different places, so that when people think Latino, it's like, you know, first right here, I'm seeing Manhattan, Queens, Philadelphia, and all. Yeah, exactly. And but also we're seeing Guatemala, Cuban, and all that. And that is something right there where we're talking about different cultures, different countries, different ways of thinking overall.
and a different music and writing.
Absolutely.
I think that that's one thing, but I think one thing that we haven't really talked about, which is really, really present in ink, is the ongoing question of, you know, are the people from down south coming up and invading our borders and stealing our jobs? And that makes people very afraid of Latinos, because if you're coming from Mexico, like my father came from Mexico in the 40s here, so that was a long time ago, but even then, he wanted to assimilate right away because he moved up to Indiana and Michigan, which were very white, most of the places that he was living, because he was living in small towns. And he immediately was like, I gotta marry a white girl and become as white as possible. And then when he would present as Mexican, it would be very, I have a newspaper clipping from Michigan in the 50s, I think, where he hosted a Latin American evening, and he had some of the white ladies from his town in Michigan dress up in the traditional clothing of Yucatan, which is where he's from, and he played the guitar and spoke, I'm sure, in a very charming accented voice, which he always did have a very pronounced accent, so no one would have said, I don't know that you don't have an accent. But it was very much sort of like, I'm putting this into a context where I'm bringing the white people into it, and I'm making sure that people who lived here feel like I'm bringing you something a little bit exotic, but it's not scary, and I'm not going to steal your jobs. And I think that one of the things that I see, when I see a lot of media representations, like The Wizards of Waverly Place, which is a Disney Channel show for children, and that family has a mother who is supposedly from Mexico and a father who is Italian-American. And the children are all mixed, and they're wizards. But the children do not want to have anything to do with their Mexican heritage. There's one point where mom wants to sing mariachi songs, and they're just like, that is the lamest thing ever, stop. And they're very much, they want to be American kids. And if you ask people what that show is about, they're not going to say it's a Latino show. They're going to say it's a show about kids doing magic.
But anyhow, my point was that still when somebody says Latino, that means many different places, many different cultures, as opposed to simply somebody saying Grecian, or in the case of my family background, and I'm first generation American, as the Jews came in, and many people, I'm Freund. There are many Freunds. John Forsyth, his name is Freund. Fred Friendly of CBS, Freund, and so forth. So that's true. The assimilation thing is true for many, but it was still, the Jews, and the same thing with taking with jobs. But there wasn't as much of the diaspora of the many different cultures. That's just one thing. The other thing that I wanted to point out, the cure, as it were, is usually, yes, you please listen, anthologies. Anthologies are the breakthroughs. It was dark matter from Cherie Renee Thomas that before that I could name, and I really did pay attention to this, 5 or 6 black writers. After Dark Matter, I can name 30.
Wow.
And so many other people who were reading Dark Matter. Another thing happened at the same time was, oh, me too. I can write this too. And there was an influx of great new writers in science fiction.
All of you go out and buy Matt's anthology.
Buy that
long hit, right?
Yeah,
That's
it's
2
just-
anthologies. We're done, right?
And if anybody knew a publisher anywhere who could put out an anthology like that,
You know, I did want to address your former point too, though, because again, I mentioned this in the little thing I wrote for Sabrina. There's also, depending on where exactly in the country you are, what I would kind of call a Reaspera. And so what happens is that there's a pan-Latino community that will form just because there are people who speak Spanish together, as they did in Sarasota, Florida in the 1970s, where there wasn't enough of a Cuban community to just be only Cubans, and so Mexicans and Ecuadorians and Hondurans and all sorts of people came together at St. Martha's Catholic Church at 1 p.m. because that was the Spanish Mass. And it became a locus. Yeah.
Still happening all
Yeah.
over.
Still, and still happening there.
and by the way, your family came from the same neighborhood as mine.
No,
That's
but so what happens?
Oh my
yeah,
goodness,
yeah.
all these questions.
Yeah, yes. So,
All right, so I know in purple, you had your hand up for a
So,
while.
just to complicate it a little bit more, realize that Hispanics have been in the Americas for a very, very long time, in the United States for long before it was the United States. I'm half Hispanic. My mother's ancestors came here in the late 17th century. That's how long we've been in New Mexico. And also, just to complicate things, they were conversos. They were Spanish Jews, and they were fleeing persecution. And they had converted to Catholicism, but no one believed them or even really cared. And so they left and went to the New World and made new lives for themselves. So it's a much more complicated story than just these are people coming to take your job.
It's
We've been here a long,
very
long time.
complicated, and for somebody who comes from Central America, to see the situation now with the children on the border, it's complicated in ways that go back decades and sometimes centuries. We do a disservice to everything in literature and in real life by flattening it, as far as I'm concerned.
And I should say that that's not by any means the only thing that I was thinking. I was just saying that we hadn't mentioned that, and that is something that scares people. And I think that's something that a lot of mainstream white America is, they're listening to Fox News and they're terrified of the things that they're hearing.
I was thinking that maybe one of the things that might make it simply easier is just one person being particularly successful. When you read young adult fiction, it still hasn't really progressed much farther beyond this classic hero tale. You start someplace that you already know, you go someplace new, and once you come back, that hero tale, that starting point isn't as Latino or black or whatever. So unless someone who gets to, say, gaming status or are able to get that far, where they're not only are they reading their books, they're also putting their faces on TV and in movies, that might have more of an effect on the people who are reading it as well. I'm an ESL teacher, and my students primarily, my first school was primarily Hispanic, Ecuadorian, and Dominican, very odd mix, and now I teach Chinese students. But they're all reading hero tales. They're all reading those Harry Potter. They're reading other people's stories. So until you actually start seeing themselves in mass media and making it okay, if somebody take that chance and are successful, they don't have to worry about it anymore. Now they can say whatever they want. They can make the movies they want, and they'll show it. And then that person can say, okay, besides me being Mexican American, I can say, oh, also this writer's also Puerto Rican or Dominican or from Ecuador. They also tell great stories too. And then you diversify. But it's going to be hard to do that if, everyone in this room is a writer or a reader, and we'll take these things almost as a given that these writers are here. But it's a small, concentrated group that will do artistic work and highlight the work, but doesn't filter as quickly into mainstream.
I think I've seen a lot more Latino names and Latino writers in young adult books actually than in any other sort of subcategory of the genre. We have our rock superstar, and that's Junot Diaz.
Yeah.
The problem is that we also, as Americans, we're really invested in the idea of the exceptional person, right? So Junot Diaz is the exception that makes us the rule, you know? He's like, okay, let me be as foul-mouthed, as mal-hablado, let me throw politics and fantasy and sci-fi in there, and look, and people will say, yeah, wow, great, okay, on to, I've read my Latino quotient for the century,
Yeah, I just want to jump on that too. But in part because I have a YA book coming out next year. So part of it is to say that it's called Shadow Shaper.
There we go.
So it's coming out from what's ironic, interesting. I sat down to write it in 2009 with the idea that I loved Harry Potter, but I didn't feel connected to it on some level too, and that I wanted us to have a Harry Potter. And the people that put out Harry Potter are the ones putting out the book, which is exciting. So that's exciting. At the same time, I also saying that I was also going to echo what Sabrina just said, which is that we have to be wary of that. Both the idea of the one and only, which is both in fantasy a cliche, and in the writer's path a cliche, because there's this idea of the breakout novelist that we sort of all subscribe to, and that is sort of enforced on us too. That we all want to be, but also that is not necessarily, well, it's certainly not the one and only model of success, but it's the one we're hand-fed. And it's a very particular and very Western idea of breaking out away from your community and doing it as a sort of this like rocket ship image of your overnight success and everything happens so fast and you're doing the shows and all this stuff, which yes is great, but we also have to always keep in mind community, which is what's always sustained us, especially as people of color, especially as people that don't necessarily fit into the norm in a lot of different ways. Community is what has held us down. But in the models of success, we're taught that we have to basically shed that community to make it. That making it means getting out. So there's that, and then I just lost my train because I was about to say something. But it's like, how do we conceive of, this is what it is. When we ask for diversity, often what we're given is a brown face who's a criminal again, or a brown face that's a jokester again, or a clown. And so it's like we have to figure out ways to demand diversity and also have a power analysis when we demand it, so that when we get one of us in there with our foot in the door, it's someone like Junot who has an analysis, who will call out all the different forms of racism that there are, because he's so loud about it, which is one thing that I really respect about him. And then also be part of leadership development, because he has VONA, which is a organization that brings up writers of color, very intentional. We have to have intentionality, is what I'm saying. So yes, we need people to break through and pave the way, and we also need them to be the right people so that they bring the rest of us up too.
It's crucial, I think, and I think, I certainly know you do, I do myself, bringing young, emerging writers, and obviously I know no major name, so it's not even, it's just somebody who's more emergent than you are at that moment, and I think that is actually a very Latino thing, to really sort of support each other, in community, but it still means that the Latino kid who's reading that YA book is probably not going to have the same sort of community that builds around a big blockbuster bestseller like Harry Potter. Because that is what Harry Potter did, right? It created a worldwide community that all spoke the same language, that all were invested in the same people. And so much of what we need to sort of see is how we build that community, how we build that community for all of us. We have 5 more minutes, so you had a question, and I know you did, and Rachel. All right, Chris.
This goes back to what Carlos was saying about talking about the resistance to reading any form of Spanish, or any language really, and the more receptive attitude for reading Elfish. And it made me think of what Hernández was saying at one of his readings that I attended. And he was talking about how when a writer like Cormac McCarthy does it, then it's artistic, because then it's seen as he has some sort of insight into this sort of community. If a native Spanish speaker does it, then it's too much dialect.
Right.
So it depends on how it's packaged.
Yep.
That's true.
But in the case of what Daniel was talking about, what everyone has been talking about getting the anthologies out, one other thing that came up at the Nebula Awards this year was the reason why we're having issues with diversity is we're still working on publicity. So it's a matter of really exploiting, well, taking advantage of what we have now at our resources like Kickstarters and social media to make sure that we get voices out there. And we can do it more so than we could before. It's just a matter of keeping it up.
Yeah.
And making sure that those who have been the gatekeepers, so to speak, like writers such as Cormac McCarthy, who have the authority to put in language when he's not a native speaker, it's making sure that we have more of us out there.
Yeah.
I also think it's really important, like Matt teaches my book, you know, like I think this is really cool. And I think at that point when I know an ESL teacher in California who told me that he teaches like kids who have been essentially tossed out of every other course, and that he really wanted, and many of them are Latinos who are in gangs, and that he wanted to give them my book because they never see any depiction of gang members that is in any way nuanced. And I think really, you know, whether it's at university level, whether it's at high school level, whether it's at middle school level, the crucial thing is that we need to get people teaching these books, giving them some exposure.
I wanted to get into the conversation about language and books with a personal experience, if that was okay. Listening to, as somebody who doesn't speak Spanish, and probably would have been kind of intimidated by the amount of Spanish in the book if I've been reading it in print, but I listened to it as an audiobook. And it was brilliant to do it that way, completely by accident, because I believe that as a reader, I would have just unconsciously skipped by the Spanish.
What book is this? Is it Oscar or
the
Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde?
Of Oscar Wilde, yeah. Brief Wonderful Life of Oscar Wilde. I believe that as a reader, I would have just, without a lot of effort, what I would have likely done is let my eye just pass over the Spanish and not been able to hear it in my mind because I don't speak the language and it wouldn't have made sense to me. But by hearing it as an audiobook, I was kind of like back to such a deeper storytelling root of it. And I also had to hear the language and couldn't skip. It was, so it was like, I recommend that, by the way, to anybody who wants that experience.
Who read that? Because it sounds like it was a good reader.
I don't remember. It was whoever did the, publishers.
But it was a good performance then.
I guess.
Yeah.
I can't tell you about the Spanish.
I think Juno reads it.
Like, most
Does it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Maybe
Then that would be a good performance.
I'll tell you that one of the joys for the Spanish speaker is when somebody gets it right and you absolutely hear the region, the music, the specificity of Spanish, and it's great.
And that's the part that I'm not able to tell you whether or not it was there. I just know that it came into my ears in a way that it wouldn't have if I had just seen it on the page. So
Oh my God, we have like just a few more minutes.
To follow up on that, from a technological standpoint, a lot of dedicated e-readers have a built-in dictionary. I wonder if there's a degree to which making sure that the publishers or the tech designers include non-English material could overcome some of the accessibility barrier for kind of monolingual Anglo readers.
Oh, yeah. Could you imagine your Kindle swearing at you, reading Brief Wonderland? Number one, Bellaco. What's Bellaco? You know, that's kind of awesome. I'd be totally for that.
What about robotic voice?
I would argue against that because I've started doing the series, I'm about to embark on doing a series of radio interviews about translations. And I've been working with Ken Liu and with Michael Kandel and fellow's name I never remember, Russian fellow in Brooklyn and all that. And you are dealing with idiomatic ideas. So talk to Ken Liu, and he's going to tell you about, there's not a God, there's the genre, and this is a concept that does not translate. So the electronic would not work, but hearing it in the language, hearing it in the, when we did, I worked with Lightspeed magazine, when we do Ken Liu, we make sure we get it right.
Guys, thank you so much.
Thank you,
Charlie. Definitely, if you want, it's for free on iBooks, or if you want a PDF, come give me your email address and I'll send you a PDF version of the listing.